Hello, Sam's fans, and welcome again to Facebook Live. Every Wednesday at about 3 p.m., we have these interviews, and I'm really excited today. I'm interviewing Dr. Kenneth Aigen, and he's published a ton of things. He's really important in the music therapy world. He was president of the AAMT, and then was also involved in the creation of the AMTA. So we'll be talking a bit about that and other things. So thank you for joining.
Sure. Very happy to be here with you, Samuel, and with our Facebook friends.
For sure. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to ask, and we'll make our best to answer. So let's get started.
Sure. Okay.
So Dr. Aigen, can you just tell us a bit about yourself first, your background, what do you study, and where have you worked?
Sure. And I'm glad you asked me about this first, because there are many different routes to becoming a music therapist, and some people aren't aware of all of them, and they think they have to follow just the conventional route. So I think if I tell you about mine, you'll see even someone that came in a very indirect way can make a very long and rewarding career as a music therapist. So I won't go back all the way to the beginning, but I will go back to my undergraduate studies. I was a psychology and philosophy major at the University of Wisconsin. And I just had interests that overlapped both areas, and I couldn't decide what to major in, so I decided to do both. And I graduated with that degree, and I did the most logical thing you can do with a philosophy and psychology undergraduate degree. I joined a country rock and roll band, because that's about all you're qualified to do with that degree.
Yeah.
And so this was like 1978 in Wisconsin, and played 2 years in this country rock band, made a living, didn't make a whole lot of money. I think we lived on $100 a week back then, but had a great time. And I had a front man who actually turned out to be, I still know him today. His name is Ken Longquist. He's my closest friend in the world. But he was a great front man, because he would just start bantering with the audience, and he'd start making up a song right on the spot about, the guy in the front row with the bald head and the blue shirt, or, the blonde lady dancing on the left corner, or whomever. And then people would find themselves being sung about right away. And we were the band, and I had to hear where was he going with the melody and the harmony and kind of back him up. So I didn't know it at the time, because I had never heard of music therapy in 1978, but it was great training for becoming a music therapist. So I did that for 2 years. I was like 24, 25 now, and I just wasn't sure what to do. I could play, I was okay, but I knew it wasn't what I was best at. So I moved back to New York, lived with my parents. They were thrilled to have me back home, And then after about a half year, my savings had run out, and I needed to get a job. And I realized I'm not going to make a living playing music in New York. There were thousands of keyboard players better than me in the area, And so I answered an ad for a school for emotionally disturbed kids. They had a theater group, and they needed an accompanist for the group, a piano player. So I answered. I said, well, I have a psych degree. I like kids. I'm a musician. Let me try for this job. And I went and tried, interviewed for the job. And what they did was they had me actually work with some of the kids. They were mostly between 8 and 14, I would say. So they had me work with the kids on some musicals, some songs they were working on. And I kind of enjoyed it. And I didn't get the job. And they said, no, they said they really wanted someone older, because they wanted someone who was going to stick around a long time. Yeah. And I guess they figured a rock and roll musician at 24 isn't going to be there for the long haul. They said, but we like the way you worked with the kids. So we have another job here, teacher's assistant, and teacher's aide. And, it wasn't the job I applied for, but it was the job I was being offered. So I accepted that job. And so this was like the middle of the school year in 1980 or so. And then I accidentally met the woman who was leaving the accompanist job, the one whose job I was applying for initially. And we just started talking. She was very friendly. And And I said, "Oh, why are you leaving?" And she said, "Well, I'm going to New York University, NYU, to study this thing called music therapy." I was like, "What? Never heard of that." This is pre-internet days, so it wasn't so easy to find a small profession like music therapy. And so she told me, "You ought to check it out." So I worked at the school for a half year and then investigated the program at NYU and started there in September of 1981. So it's just to say, I didn't have an undergraduate degree in music therapy. I started the study of music therapy at the master's level. And many people are under the impression that if you don't have an undergraduate degree in music therapy, you have to do an undergraduate equivalency degree. It's not true. That's some misinformation that's been spread around. There are a handful of programs, New York University, Drexel in Philadelphia, Leslie in Boston, that allow you to begin the study of music therapy at the master's level without having an undergraduate degree. And the only reason I bring that up is I think people aren't aware of it. And I was just really lucky. I went to NYU because I was living in New York. I didn't realize at the time it was one of the only places I could have started in school. So, so I graduated in 1984. I worked at a school for 2 years. Then I worked at an outpatient facility for people with psychiatric concerns called the Creative Arts Rehabilitation Center. It was founded by a very important music therapy pioneer named Florence Tyson, who pioneered the idea of music therapy in the community, not in an institution. I'm giving you the quick career synopsis now. I worked in outpatient psychiatry for 4 or 5 years. And then I got a research grant. I went and lived and worked in Denmark for a year. Then I came back in 1991, where I started working at the brand new Nordhoff Robbins Center at New York University. And I worked there for 15 years, first 7 years as the research director. And then my last 8 years, I worked there as co-director along with Dr. Alan Turry. Left there in 2006 and went to Temple University, where I wasn't running a clinic. I was on a faculty line. So I was music therapy faculty there, and had a very large program at Temple. They had bachelor's, master's, and doctoral programs. So I got to teach at all 3 levels. And then in 2013, I was able to return back to my home at New York University. And I've been there since 2013. And now I'm director of the music therapy program. We have a master's program, and we have 2 doctoral degree programs as well. And so teaching the masters, do research, and do doctoral supervision. So that's how my time's occupied these days.
All right. Yeah, it looks like you've done a lot of things, and I'm sure, we could spend so much talking about everything that you've done, but
that's a nice way of saying I'm really old. I've been around a long time.
No.
Just kidding.
Right. Yeah. But I think we have a few things that I would love to talk to you about, and maybe in the future we get to talk again. But first, just because I studied jazz in my undergrad and I've been playing this music, I love it. And also because the first article by you that I read was this article on social interaction in jazz, implications for music therapy. So I wanted to ask you about that. Can you maybe tell us a bit of the general idea of the article and how it came about?
Yeah, sure. I won't go into too much detail, but I'll give you some context for it. Well, first of all, writing a work that draws from the scholarly work on jazz and applies it to music therapy suits my basic beliefs that music therapists should be drawing from music disciplines in creating theory. So much of the theory in music therapy comes from psychology and psychotherapy and from neuroscience and learning theory. But, I'm very much a believer in the primacy of music. And my feeling is, well, you know what? People in music therapy are making music together. It's just people make music together in a lot of different avenues in the world, right? In performance and religious purposes, for recreation, and also for therapy. And so theories that come out of the study of how people make music together should be applicable to music therapy, and yet almost nobody draws from music disciplines. So I wanted to show how we can apply ideas from from musicology and apply them in music therapy. So that was one of the prime underlying ideas, underlying motivations I had. But in terms of some of the more specifics, I would say that another misimpression that people have is that, that there's something that distinguishes music therapy from all other kinds of music. And that's that in other kinds of music, people are focused on just making music. And in music therapy, we're not so focused on quality music making, but we're more focused on personal interaction and personal expression. Mm-hmm. Now, I do agree there is a difference between performance and therapy. They're not the same things, of course, but I don't think the differences are as strong as people have made it out. And so I think it's a difference of degree, not of type. And so one of the themes I pursue in that article is that it's just not true that in music therapy, we only focus on social interaction in music, and in jazz or other forms of music, they just focus on the musical product. So I wanted to show in jazz, there's lots of social interaction, and that the different roles people take in a jazz situation have a profound income on the final product, on the music. And conversely, I wanted to show how in music therapy, clients especially are very concerned with quality of music. I mean, that's their motivation, is to make and experience quality music making. And from the client, many of our clients may not even have a concept of therapy. It's just music time to them. Right. And it's our perspective that calls it therapy. It's their perspective that's just making music. And I think the client's perspective is at least as important, if not more so, than the therapist's perspective. So, in the article, I just draw some of the parallels. Both forms of music are improvised. Both forms have social interaction and roles that are taken. In jazz, you have a rhythm section that supports the expression of the soloist. And I talk a lot about how the parallel in music therapy is you have a therapist who's there to support the emotional expression of the client. So I kind of go into a lot of the parallels between the therapist's role in therapy and the rhythm section's role in jazz. And then I talk about how many of the challenges are the same. If you listen to a good rhythm section, as a solo develops, they'll ratchet up the intensity of the music. The drummer will punch in accents to reflect the soloist playing. Now, if they don't react at all, the soloist doesn't feel heard. If they react too much, then they lose the groove because they're too busy reacting. Right. Same thing in music therapy. If as therapists, we mirror and reflect and react to everything the client does, we lose the flow and pulse of the music, which is the very thing that's giving the client freedom to express him or herself. But if we don't react at all, then the client feels unheard and isolated. So this challenge of how much to react to the soloist or the client, and in what ways to react, and how to do both things, how to keep the pulse and flow and groove flowing, while at the same time still communicating. So that you can see the challenges are really similar. And so I think, what I do in that article is explore all of these various parallels.
Yeah, and I love it. I totally agree. And I think there's so much of what you said that is so valuable to hear and to understand. And another thing is that you've mentioned before that the term of Nordhoff Robbins music therapy. You're in the music therapy Nordhoff Robbins Music Therapy Center. So, but the thing is, for some of our supporters and followers, they're not music therapists, so they might not have heard this term. So I think if we can spend just a little bit talking about what that is, because I think it's also really interesting.
Yeah, sure. And although it's a particular approach in music therapy, some people call it a model. I'm not sure. I don't know if we'd call it a framework, a model, an approach. But I can just tell you what it is and let each person decide for themselves what it is. So it's a way of doing music therapy that was first developed by these two men, Paul Nordhoff and Clive Robbins, who met each other in 1959. Clive Robbins was a special education teacher at a therapeutic community in England. Paul Nordhoff was a composer and a professor of music. And Nordhoff had this idea that improvised music could be used to help children with disabilities. And there was some music therapy going on at this time, not much, and none of it really used improvisation at all. So Nordhoff had heard, he subscribed to this philosophy of anthroposophy, which is more like it's not a religion, it's I would call it a spiritual philosophy. And some people have heard of Rudolf Steiner. He was the man who originated anthroposophy. Some people have heard of the Waldorf schools. These are schools that are, they're not religious in nature, but they're built upon the principles of anthroposophy. So Nordhoff decided, I'm going to go on a tour of these anthroposophic homes throughout Europe because I hear they use music in a curative way and see what they're doing. And he didn't really find anything that he resonated with. But then he ran into Clive Robbins, and together they started creating their approach to music therapy. So what defines it? I'll give you 4 or 5 defining qualities. First of all, it's improvised, and it's not music for a client, it's music with a client. So the idea is we work with people who may have musical skills or may have none. So we use instruments that are highly rewarding and sound very good, but don't require a steep learning curve to play. So whereas, very few of us could walk up to a violin or an oboe and make a pleasing sound right. It would take years to create a sound. Just about all of us can walk up to a cymbal or drum or a set of wind chimes or a xylophone or a piano and play it in a way and draw pleasing tones from it. So we tend to use those kind of instruments. And the idea is we invite a client into the music therapy room. There are all these instruments there. And we take up whatever the client does and create a musical context around it. So what might not initially be communicative or expressive acquires those qualities. So, for example, if a child sees a drum in the middle of the room, takes it up, starts playing it, beating it, we'll hear the tempo of that music. We'll start playing in the child's tempo. We may play double time, half time. We'll build melodic phrases around it. We may get louder and softer, faster and slower, and the child responds to us. And all of a sudden, someone who may never have played music in his or her life is now engaged in a creative, interactive musical expression. Maybe the child is autistic and doesn't even touch the instruments, but just maybe sways back and forth and maybe makes a nonverbal sound, It's a typical autistic behavior. So we'll take up the tempo in our playing. We'll hear the tonality. We'll use that as the tonal center for our improvisation. And perhaps the tones the child is making start changing according to the harmonies that we provide. And without realizing it, the child's now engaged in a improvisational musical vocal interaction. So the idea is that before you can have relationship, you have to have communication. And to communicate with someone who might be nonverbal or who might not really understand the very idea of communication, how can someone communicate in words if they don't know what it is to communicate? So the idea is we're bypassing some of the areas of disability and reaching the person's inner capabilities and capacities that may be undamaged by the disability. So what does the therapist play, though? The idea is that if I'm working with someone, I look at that person and I try to create what I call a portrait in sound. It's not a painting portrait. It's a portrait in sound of the person's inner being.
Yeah.
When I look at this person, when I look at the facial expression, when I look at the body language, when I hear the sounds, what music comes to mind? So I'll start using that type of scale or mode or tonality or style. And the underlying theory is that someone who's quite isolated can't help but recognize and react when there's something outside the music that's responding or reflecting something inside. So someone who might be otherwise very self-involved and caught up in his or her own isolated world, all of a sudden starts relating to the external world through this music. That's a portrait of that person's inner life. So while the session's improvised, essential to the work is that we watch the recordings of every session. And we do this for two reasons. One, sometimes the client will respond in subtle ways that we don't catch at the time. Maybe the client did a triple meter to our duple, or the client was singing a fifth above where I was singing. And then we learn, oh, this client showing really good astute musical perception. I didn't realize it at the time. Let me work with that next week. The other thing we do is we'll notate themes and motifs and melodies that seemed effective, that seemed to capture the person. We'll watch it, slow it down, make the notation, and then we'll bring it back the following week. So even though the sessions are improvised, over the course of therapy, you develop a whole repertoire of themes and melodies and motifs that become sort of the structural signposts for the improvised session, so that you develop an individualized repertoire for each client that comes out of the moment-to-moment interactions with those clients.
Definitely. That's awesome. And so for anybody who might have joined just recently, we're talking about Nordhoff Robbins music therapy here with Dr. Kenneth Aigen. And so what you're telling me, it sounds really amazing, but it also sounds like a music therapist needs to be really perceptive, and not just to the client, but also to the music and to what he or she is doing in either the piano or whatever instrument. So I'm also wondering if a music therapist who wants to take this approach of Nordhoff Robbins needs more training.
Yeah, in the U.S., we think about Nordhoff Robbins as an advanced specialization in music therapy, like guided imagery in music or analytical music therapy. It's really difficult work to do well. It's very demanding. Because, and you know what our training consists of is learning how to improvise, but improvise in a way that has a compositional feel. If you see the best work of Paul Nordhoff and Carol Robbins, who succeeded Paul working with Clive, and Alan Turry, who's director of the center now, if you see the work of the people who do this really well, you could swear the improvisations were composed because they're so highly structured. So what our training involves is learning to improvise in as many styles and scales and modes as you can imagine, because that just gives you a larger vocabulary as a therapist. If you can only play in certain styles or scales or habitual keys, you can't offer the diversity of experiences that the diversity of clients warrants. So for the Nordhoff Robbins work, every summer we offer 2 different week-long summer courses for music therapists who just want to get a taste of it and see what it's like. And then we also have now a distance training, which involves combining some intensive courses with ongoing supervision and lectures at a distance, so you don't have to relocate to New York for a year to do the training. There's also training programs in Korea. There, of course, in London, the original training program, Australia. So there are programs around the world. And I think even if a person's not interested in training in the approach and becoming a Nordhoff Robbins therapist, I think there's a lot to be gained from learning about the approach and then applying it. Because to me, the principles are applicable regardless of your level of musicianship or the specific model in which you practice.
Definitely. I agree. And we're kind of running out of time here, but I really wanted to talk to you about something else. So I was recently reading a paper that came out, I think, last year about the AAMT and the NAMT, which used to be the 2 music therapy organizations up till 1991, right?
Not quite, but it probably happened before you were born, so I can tell you about it.
Yes.
Yeah. So the first music therapy association in the U.S. was the National Association for Music Therapy, NAMT, formed in 1950. And then in 1970, a second association was formed, the American Association for Music Therapy, formed at New York University. It was more of a Northeast approach. It had, the people forming it had some philosophical differences. They wanted, in the old day, the original model, people did a 4-year degree, and then they went off anywhere in the country to do an internship. So the practical experience was not well integrated to the academic experience. People learned all about music therapy before they even begin to learn how to do it. And AAMT wanted to integrate the clinical training with the classroom learning. And also the AAMT pioneered what was called a competencies-based approach. So rather than mandating that schools had to offer certain classes, it said, we don't want to dictate what classes a school should offer. What we should articulate is, what are the competencies that a professional music therapist should be expected to do? We'll list these competencies, and as long as you can show us that your curriculum meets those competencies, will approve your program. So it was a much more flexible approach. And in fact, if you look at the current AMTA, it really has taken on those things. So there were 2 different associations from 1970 until 1998, so for 28 years. But in 1994, I'm trying to remember now exactly, I got together first with, I was president of AAMT at the time, the smaller one, the one located in the Northeast. Brian Hunter was president of the NAMT at the time. And we got together along with our business advisors. AAMT's business advisor was Norm Goldberg, a music publisher. NAMT's was Carl Brun from Yamaha. And we just started talking, and we realized we had a lot more in common than we had that was separating us. And so Brian and I initiated a process of unification of the 2 organizations back into one association. And the article you're talking about, it's a detailed article in Music Therapy Perspectives from last fall, because we were celebrating the 20th anniversary of the new organization. So that's what you're referring to. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting to read also how, the one that I found more interesting, or just a bit funny, how you sent a letter to Brian saying that you wanted to do this, and then you met with him and the letter never got there. So
when I met with him, he said he never got the letter, and I was kind of startled. So when I started discussing how I wanted to talk about unifying the organizations, he was shocked. I mean, I think his jaw could have hit the floor, because the 2 organizations had been at odds. There were a lot of issues that separated us, and actually I was someone who was very strident in my opposition to NAMT, because I felt they were engaged in a few practices that were not fair to AAMT members. I was honest about those. You can read about them in the article. But I also saw that, maybe the best way to reconcile these differences was to unify, rather than to try to get one organization to change to the other.
Right, definitely.
Yeah.
And so how do you think it's come? I mean, you also mentioned it a bit on your article, but after 20 years of the new AMTA, do you think that things are a lot better, or how do you see the situation?
I think on balance, unification was a really good thing, and I'm very pleased with it. It doesn't mean that there weren't things that didn't work out the way I had hoped. The things that did work out the way I had hoped, we combined our resources, so we were able to achieve more. Rather than having 2 offices and 2 executive directors, we were able to speak with one voice in terms of networking with legislators or regulatory bodies. So that was a real success. I felt AAMT was a small organization, and our members had a lot to offer. And we were speaking, only within our own small community. So I think I was really happy that now there's a much broader audience for those folks and their ideas and their practices. The educational unification, I think, was very effective, and now we can really offer different approaches to education. One thing I wasn't so pleased with was the outcome of the publications, where the AMT had a quite unique journal. And it was the first journal. We had color pictures of mandalas from GIM sessions. We pioneered including recordings, music recordings in the journal. We started doing qualitative research. So that journal was closed as a result of unification, which I was sorry. But, and I would say for the first 10 or 15 years of the unification, the existing AMTA journals, I wasn't pleased with their direction. But they have both been, I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, have been under new direction that I think has taken them in very, very positive and updated ways.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we're kind of running out of time here. If you still have a few minutes, and I didn't want you for this, so it's okay if you're saying no, but I was just wondering if you had a story. Sometimes I like hearing the stories from music therapists, something that could come to your mind.
A story?
With a patient or something like that.
You should have prepared me here a little bit.
Yeah. I apologize. I forgot about that. And
well,
if you don't have a good one, it's fine.
Well, I'll mention one client just because I've written about him. He's been so important, and I've not been doing clinical work for quite a while, so all my stories are from memory. But one client that I've written a lot about was a man named Lloyd, and I worked together with him with Alan Turry. I should mention the Nordhoff Robbins approach. There are 2 therapists in a session, even in individual sessions. Typically, one therapist is providing the music and the other therapist is supporting the client's participation. So if the client is hyperactive and distractible, the co-therapist can run around the room and bring the client back to the instrument, and so the therapist doesn't have to stop the musical interaction. And I was working with Alan with a 27-year-old man named Lloyd. And I don't know, one day Lloyd was, he brought, we were working with a drum and cymbal, as we often do with clients. And Lloyd brought his chair over to the drum, and he was very uncoordinated. He was nonverbal. He had a low untestable IQ. He had a lot of problems with, he needed help dressing himself and doing all kinds of tasks, but he loved music and he had a real subtle, nuanced musical sensitivity. And so he brings the chair over and he was playing and he was holding the drumsticks in a really nice way with us. And I got this image that he's trying to create a drum set, because the way he moved the drum down, he put the cymbal here and he had the chair. And so I said, Alan, let's bring in a whole trap set, And so we brought in the next week bass, kick drum, snare, tom-tom, hi-hat, ride cymbal. Of course, he just sat down right at it. And he was a natural. He never played a drum set in his life. But it was clear that he was a very natural, intuitive musician. And if he hadn't had the seizures and things that caused his difficulties, he might have grown up to be a musician.
Yeah.
And so from that started a long course of therapy that lasted 7 years with Lloyd and Alan and I. And actually, I wrote a book about it called Playing in the Band, a book with a DVD where you can see the excerpts. And it made me realize that for Lloyd, this wasn't music therapy. What he was doing, he was forming a band with his friends. The same thing you did probably, and I did, and many people do as teenagers, right? And it made me realize that sometimes music therapy, what our responsibility is just to provide access to music and to provide access to the intrinsic benefits of music for people who can't do it on their own.
Yeah.
So as therapists, we called it therapy because we're therapists. For Lloyd, it was just making music with his mom said this. Lloyd just thinks you're his music buddies. It's not there. And the paradox is he developed incredibly in his impulse control, focusing ability, emotional control. He improved greatly in many areas of motor functioning, cognition, affect, social skills. But we never focused on those directly. We just focused on providing him an experience of playing in the band. Right. And it was through his ability to access the intrinsic qualities of music that paradoxically all of these other secondary benefits occurred. So I would say Lloyd was my greatest teacher as a music therapist, and I'm always grateful to him for that.
Yeah, awesome. That's a great story. I love it. Well, Oh, we have one comment. Oh, great story. So this is Nikki. She's the founder of Sans Fans.
Ah.
And
hey, Nikki.
And yeah, so I don't think we have any more comments or questions. So is there anything else that was left unsaid that you would like to say now?
No, I don't think so. I'd never heard of your organization, Samuel, when you approached me, but I just looked it up, and it looks like you're doing wonderful work. And I just applaud you and all of the non-music therapy supporters. I'm grateful to any non-music therapist that understands the value of what we do and how, for many of our clients, it's the only thing that really works for them. So just want to express my gratitude to you and to them for all the work you're doing.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. And thank you for, as always, I say it, Sans Fans, the supporters, the donors. We have a 5K coming up, and it's 300, 400 people coming out to run the race and to fundraise for music therapy, even though, like you said, they're not music therapists. So we're hopeful for them. So then next Wednesday, I'm going to have Dr. Noah Potvin. So anybody wants to tune in for that, definitely do so. And
he's a very articulate and interesting guy. He's a former student of mine. Say hello for me.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that. Yeah. Thank you. And then till next Wednesday, thanks for tuning in. And thank you, Dr. Aigen.
Okay, bye, everybody.